Now, of all the what-if type scenarios in Star Wars, perhaps the most interesting is what if Qui-Gon Jinn had won his duel with Darth Maul and gone on to train Anakin? And of course, why this is such a fascinating question is because it opens the door to many other questions we don't exactly have the answers to. Such as, what was the Chosen One supposed to do exactly? Were things supposed to transpire exactly as they did? Was he supposed to help destroy the errant Jedi of the prequel era, before then eventually destroying the Sith and leaving one lone Jedi to rebuild a new Jedi Order, which of course is how it did all play out, or would have had Luke not failed? Or were the Jedi of the prequel era not meant for total destruction at all? Was Anakin just supposed to destroy the Sith while helping the Jedi see the error in their ways? Maybe all the Chosen One was really supposed to do was lure out the Sith, to tempt the Master Sith into revealing himself in the hopes of garnering an extremely powerful apprentice, which is of course what pretty much did happen. And as I've suggested elsewhere, if Anakin doesn't stop Mace Windu from killing Palpatine, perhaps that would have saved the Jedi, that serving the Republic directly and fighting a war for them, while it was being led by a Sith Lord they could not sense, would have been the lesson they needed to get themselves back on track. Sure, it would have been a long, hard, and very costly lesson, but such a high price would have allowed them to truly appreciate how far they'd fallen, and then they could have begun to right the ship. Or perhaps events were supposed to play out entirely differently, and that all got ruined when Maul killed Qui-Gon Jinn on Naboo, and I do personally think this is the case, and that's because I believe the Sith are like wild cards that the Force simply cannot predict. And though I'm not saying the Sith actively seek to destroy the balance or intentionally work against the will of the Force, I think it's safe to say they have no regards for it whatsoever, and they will do whatever they must to achieve their own goals. And as Obi-Wan once said, only a Sith deals in absolutes, and what I think he really meant was that Sith only care about what they want, and don't care what they have to do to make it happen. They have become so selfish or self-absorbed that, to put it simply, it's their way or the highway. And this selfishness is so all-consuming, so against the balance that the Force desires, that the Force cannot accurately predict or foresee their actions, which is why I don't think Qui-Gon being killed by Maul and Obi-Wan being trained by Anakin was part of the plan for the Chosen One. And I know some of you might counter by saying that if the Force cannot predict the actions of the Sith, how was Palpatine so good at foreseeing the future through the Force? And though this is just a theory of mine, I don't think Palpatine was seeing the future as much as he was willing the future he desired to come to pass, that his own will and power with the dark side was just that strong. And it's interesting to note that the one thing that Palpatine could not see was Luke's arrival on Endor, and why I believe this was the case is because Luke's will to save his father was stronger than Palpatine's in this matter, and Palpatine, with all that self-confidence of his, which Luke accurately said was his greatest weakness, didn't even begin to understand or predict what was going to happen when he sent Vader to Luke. Anyway, to get back on track here, I really don't think Obi-Wan was ever meant to train Anakin. I think the Force led Qui-Gon to Anakin so that he would be the one to train him, and train him the right way. But the Force did not foresee Qui-Gon being killed by Maul, and that Obi-Wan would then be the one to train him instead. And I know that some people were upset that in my last video I described why and how Obi-Wan failed Anakin in regards to his training. That despite what might initially seem like an altruistic little boy, Anakin was actually very ambitious and prideful, and Obi-Wan failed to train that out of him, as is clearly shown in Attack of the Clones. However, I really wasn't trying to take away from just how great of a Jedi Obi-Wan was, and especially of how great of one he would ultimately be, because let's not forget he spent nearly 2 decades in exile, watching over Luke and training himself how to become a Force ghost, which he would succeed at. The reality of it, though, was that Obi-Wan wasn't ready to train anyone yet, least of all the Chosen One, because he himself had just been knighted. And the crazy part is that it was the very same day Obi-Wan officially became a Jedi that Anakin became his Padawan. And something tells me that's not how it usually goes, that a knight usually waits at least a few years before taking on an apprentice, or is even allowed to take one on. And as for why someone else didn't train Anakin, like Yoda or another master, well, there's only really one good explanation for that, which is that's just how the story had to go. Though a case could be made that, just maybe, the Jedi Council decided to honor Qui-Gon's last request that Obi-Wan be the one to train Anakin. Okay, so what does happen then if Qui-Gon trains Anakin instead? And mind you, this is just my theory, and I'd love to hear your own thoughts on the matter in the comments below, or if you think maybe Obi-Wan truly was meant to be the one who trained Anakin, and everything happened as the Force wanted it to. Anyway, the first curious thing that probably happens, or should I say doesn't happen, is that Dooku likely never leaves the Jedi Order, or if he does, he never becomes a Sith and instead goes off with Qui-Gon and helps train Anakin, because I do think that a great rift would have formed between Qui-Gon and the Council if he insisted on training Anakin despite already having a Padawan. And speaking of that Padawan Qui-Gon already had, it'd be interesting if Obi-Wan decided not to go with Qui-Gon, Dooku, and Anakin, and instead stayed loyal to the Council, and that in turn made him a target for Sidious to take the spot of Darth Maul as his apprentice. Now, that likely wouldn't have been the case considering Sidious, in the absence of Dooku, would have been looking for someone else similar to Dooku to lead the eventual Separatist movement and army, and I'm not sure Obi-Wan would be the right fit, or that he'd ever turn to the dark side in the first place. I then think events play out much as they actually did, where eventually the Clone Wars begin and the Jedi find themselves leading Republic forces, and eventually Order 66 happens and most of the Jedi are wiped out, all the while Dooku and Qui-Gon have been off training Anakin to be the perfect Jedi, and far away from the watchful eye of Palpatine, mostly by default, because they likely wouldn't be anywhere near Coruscant or worlds where the Clone Wars were raging. And if my theory about Palpatine not actually seeing future events, but being able to will them to come to pass is true, or along the right lines at least, he would not foresee, or certainly not will, his demise to happen at the hands of Anakin, and hence would not be ready to fight him. Because shortly after the destruction of the Jedi Order is when I think Qui-Gon, Dooku, and Anakin would come forth to challenge Sidious and whoever his apprentice might be, and I think they would defeat them. And once Anakin defeats Sidious, I also then think the remnants of the Jedi Order, those who survived Order 66, rally to and then behind Anakin, and he goes on to create a new Jedi Order, and the galaxy and the Force are finally balanced. One way or the other, though, I think a cleansing fire of some type was needed to, shall we say, fix the Jedi Order who had clearly lost their way. Hence their ability to wield the Force had diminished, as Yoda and Mace Windu talk about at one point in Revenge of the Sith. And this was happening because they were no longer aligning themselves with the will of the Force, but rather with the will of the Republic, up to the point they were now fighting a war for them. And whereas not aligning themselves with the will of the Force is not an issue for a Sith who has no qualms about taking power and manipulating and corrupting the Force for their own ends, a Jedi will not do the same. Instead, they more or less rely on the Force to lend them power in order to in turn serve it. Remember, the Force flows through a Jedi, that they are like a conduit for its will. They do not draw it to them and reshape it as a Sith would. Which is why Luke's lesson to Rey in The Last Jedi is a rather odd one, where he claims the Jedi thought the Force belonged to them, because, and it's almost ironic, if that had been their belief, they likely wouldn't have started to lose power, and may not have failed in the time of the prequels, though they likely would have eventually fallen to the dark side in the process. Anyway, I think more evidence to the fact that Qui-Gon was meant to train Anakin is because, more than likely, Padme never again becomes a part of Anakin's life under his training, which means Palpatine has very little to use against Anakin, even if he'd realized Anakin was going to be a great threat in the first place, which he may not have if Qui-Gon had essentially taken him and trained him far away from Coruscant, as I suggested earlier. This also means no Luke and Leia, and no more powerful Skywalker blood lingering around after Anakin eventually passed on, and that in turn means no Ben Solo, to go and start the cycle of fallen Skywalkers all over again. We also have to keep in mind that, like it or not, Luke failed to rebuild the Jedi Order, so if everything proceeded exactly as the Force had wanted it to, well, it still didn't end up balanced in the end, at least not for very long. And sure, you could cite my own theory about Sith or dark side users being like wildcards, and say that the Force could not have foreseen Snoke manipulating Ben Solo and turning him to the dark side, but we then still have the problem of where Snoke even came from in the first place, and why the prophecy didn't involve dealing with him, or maybe it did, and everything is still unfolding exactly how it should, and Kylo Ren killing Snoke has all been part of the plan. Honestly though, just to touch on this very briefly here at the end, I think Snoke came forth in the absence of any Sith and the absence of a strong Jedi Order. In other words, if Anakin had been trained by Qui-Gon and destroyed Sidious and immediately rebuilt the Jedi Order, I think Snoke remains in hiding indefinitely. It's about the only way I can see his existence making sense to the overall story, that he didn't think he could defeat the Jedi and that he was waiting for the Sith to go extinct before re-emerging, though it doesn't exactly explain why his existence wasn't unbalancing the Force all along. And I'm sure that has nothing to do with poor planning on the part of those making the sequel trilogy or anything like that. Because if that were the case, they might be inclined to kill him off before they ever have to explain him. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Was Qui-Gon meant to train Anakin, or did things transpire and continue to transpire as they were meant to? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.